at the Center of National Monuments. Jérôme David, founder of ZENT, is that how you pronounce it? All right. A partner of the National Monuments Center. We also have Florian, co-founder of CTRL, and Olivier Lambert will be moderating this roundtable. He's a member of the PXN network, and he works at Lumento. Olivier, you're on. Thank you so much. And good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. We are very happy to be here tonight to discuss immersive technologies and environmental responsibility. My name is Olivier Lambert. I am a producer for Lumento, which is part of PXN. This is an association that we founded in 2015. You need a headset. PXN is, as I was saying, an association founded in 2015, and that brings together 75 independent producers. Some of them specializing in immersive experiences, and all of them experienced in digital experiences. So the question of ecological responsibility is part of what we want to work on. With PXN, we develop two different offers. The first idea, the thing we work on, is to raise awareness in the sector as to the ecological footprint of those offers. And the second thing that we do is a study on the environmental impact of immersive works. I'm very happy to be here today to moderate this roundtable with our four guests. Together, we will be hearing from their experience on those topics. And I have one first question for you, Florian. Florian from CTRL. Do you think that we can have a sustainable, responsible, immersive technology? Oh, you're kicking off with an easy one, right? I think it depends on what you mean when you talk about ecological environmental responsibility and how you define it. Should it be a collective choice? Should it be led by a number of entities or companies? Or is this a choice that is anchored in legislation? For me, an immersive technology can be seen as being responsible or not, depending on which criteria you use. There have been a lot of critics, and I think there has been a lot of criticism, and I think it's quite fair because the definition of responsibility is quite broad. And when you're talking about the green transition, there's a lot of fuzziness around the concept. Landia, EGAL, you're a producer yourself. I would like to know how you decided that you would switch to a more responsible way of creating those works. There's a project that is called Okawari. I'm one of the authors of this project. We presented it in August and September 2022. We also presented it in Amsterdam and in Toulouse. And the point was not to be greener, but to raise awareness among the audience about all the impacts all along the life cycle of the work. So if I was to sum up, you have this work that is a virtual responsibility work, and we upcycled an experience that had already been selected in the Venice Biennial before that. So we recycled the work that existed, but with a complete different storytelling. It was about food overconsumption, and it opened up a number of questions about the collapse of society depending on user choices. I'm not going to tell you everything about this work. I think it will be presented in Paris soon-ish. But you have this VR experience that was the visible side, but there was a hidden side. And all the elements of the decor were returned after the end of the experience. So you had the visible side of the UVA, and then we wanted to show all of the very tangible elements that are necessary for such a work, including submarine cables, for example. And we tried to demonstrate how those different elements were manufactured, what kind of consumption was needed for that, water, energy, but also manpower. So it really was a way of showing the ecological footprint and the raw materials that went into creating this work. And then we demonstrated the obsolescence of such creations and the equipment as well. Like VR helmets are already obsolete for many of them today because this is an area where things change very fast. So after a couple of years, you can't use them anymore. On top of that, there is a very low level of recycling. So we also talked about recycling. And we can imagine that there will be a boom in this sector, in augmented reality, in VR. And those uses depend on raw material where the extraction peak is very close. There's all of that, and of course there's also the carbon footprint, which, to be honest, was the easiest to measure. And there was a carbon counter on the installation. So it ticked up whenever you had people coming in into the exhibit. And at the end, we came to 50 tons equivalent for people, taking into account both the people there and the creation of the exhibit itself. So that was the equivalent of a full year of carbon consumption by 5 people for the French average. So that's all the questions that we wanted to look at. Thank you, Landia. Patrick Bergeot, you work at the Center for National Monuments, and you have been working since 2019 with a task force on this kind of issues. How? Well, first I should say that the CMN today is working on digital sobriety, as we call it, so being less resource intensive. Of course, we have the monuments, but we have also a lot of parks and gardens, and the first avenues for work started there. We have a very decentralized structure, and with my service, with my department, we work mostly on digital aspects. And one of the things that we wanted to do was to see how we could measure the impacts of those actions. Yes, many of those issues are very interesting for our national monuments and museums. But we realized that it was quite difficult to measure the footprint of our activities. So we launched a project, and we had a partnership with ZENT, and they'll tell you about their data center running on green hydrogen. And the first thing that we wanted to do was to even have figures. When you are using software and you decide to shift to a greener data center, what's the difference? What difference does it make? Many people today will tell you, well, we work from the cloud. But in the cloud, you don't know exactly where you are. You can't really know or measure the consumption of power and everything else. What about VR helmets as well? It's very difficult to measure. Depending also on the protocols that you're using, you can be using up less power, but you will then have lower diffusion in terms of the audience that you are able to reach. So you need to decide what you want, and you need to be able to compare on a life cycle basis. And so now we want to work with ZENT, with Jérôme, to be able to better understand how things can be weighed and how the different choices will impact our usage of all of that in the longer run. All right, so turning to you, Jérôme. David, there is a specific demand coming from CMN. How do you answer it? What we do is that we host services with local sources. For example, we have a pilot data center in Avignon where we are able to use only green energy 24/7 all year long. And this is a concept that we have been developing since 2017. We couple that with a specific life cycle model, and we do a full life cycle analysis using scientific publications, and we try to have a multi-criteria approach. Because, of course, there is greenhouse gases and carbon emissions, but it's not the only criterion that we want to look at. And you need to have servers if you want to have immersive experiences. But then we work with different platforms, and we try to be able to measure all the different criteria: production, consumption, immediate consumption in real time as well. So this is one of the things that we do with the CMN. The second thing that we do is we try to identify options to improve. We want, for example, to make sure that if we need some lithium, we'll try to find ways to diminish our consumption instead of just, increasing consumption all the time. And that would mean that new mines open all the time elsewhere in the world. So we try to identify how we can be more eco-friendly in our design. But of course, this takes a lot of time. So what I'm telling you about is taking place over the course of 2 full years. And we identify what we call those hotspots. So those are the areas where we can improve. And we publish our emission factors every year, and we keep a keen eye on how the situation changes. Because we know that the situation in January 2022 is different from the situation today. So if you look at carbon footprints, for example, you can see that we projected that we would have 50 grams of CO2 on our mix, and the actual figures are 100 grams. So we try to update that on a rolling basis. To do so, we reassess our data every 5 years, more or less. And that's just a time frame that is too long. So we need to have an update that is more frequent. And that's part of what we try to do. Florian Guillanton, at Control S, what is your approach when you have a new project? You ask the same kind of questions? You also try to identify all the ways that you can reduce your impact on the environment? Absolutely. It's absolutely in line with what Jérôme was saying about updating indicators. They can change a lot depending on where you are and when you are. As a design studio, one of the questions that we need to ask is why do we do what we choose to do? Are we creating a new form of usage? Is it useful? And if so, how do we anticipate the impacts of this new creation? As was said, there's the issue of carbon emissions, but not just. We also look at social models. To take an example, more concretely, if you're looking at the user experience of people who will be using Uber Eats or similar apps, for the user, they think, okay, that's wonderful, I can stay at home and have my food delivered at home. But it has social impacts. And if you take those social impacts into account, well, then you'll get different results. And when we try to look at the impacts, we try to take into account all of those criteria. And it also means that we might choose a different solution at the end of the day. And of course, economic issues are relevant as well. We have many different constraints. We have alternative systems, but not all of them have the same needs in terms of power, in terms of bandwidth, for example. So we need to pick the right protocols, to choose the ones that have the lowest levels of consumption, but at the same time to make sure that we get the best experience possible. Because we're creating a service, so of course we need to make sure that the people using those services will have a great experience. And that's as true in the cultural sector as in any other sector. Landia, EGAL, turning to you now. You were telling us about your experience in Venice. How was it received? And when it comes to the awareness of the audience, you're an author yourself. Who do you want to raise awareness with? For Okawari in Venice, our target group was content creator, public decision makers, device manufacturers. So we had people from Meta, we had people from government agencies, we had content creators, we had festival programmers. So we wanted to raise awareness with all our peers as well as to the social impacts of their work. That's something that we've been working on for years. Really a question that we ask on a daily basis. When I create this or that, is it really positive? Does it have a net positive impact? Because some people will find it wonderful and buy a device to be able to use it, but is it really going to bring more to the table than what it's going to cost to our world? We know that we're in a world with limited resources. They are more and more expensive. It's very destructive for the environment to extract more of them. We're aware of that. And it really came from a personal place. I stopped everything I was doing to get training. It took me a full year. I worked with the climate fresco. I read a lot of reports. I participated in a lot of workshops. So I really trained myself on those issues before I was able to see the bigger picture. And I wanted to share my experience doing that. And I wanted also to talk to people who are active in the same environment I am. With this work, we had to admit that we were unable to really assess and measure the impacts in a very precise manner. Carbon is kind of easy. That's the easiest, at least. And yet, it's already difficult. Because, for example, if you're looking at transportation, it's the number of kilometers that you travel on, and then you need to calculate how much emissions you have for 1 liter of gasoline. So that's easy enough. But it's not that easy, again, because you have different assumptions as to how you're moving around, for example. So you need to keep a critical eye on those issues. And depending on what assumptions you apply, you end up with completely different results. It's also true that you'll have completely different results in 2 different countries. So we have 11 criteria plus carbon emissions. So we have this full list of criteria, and it's really difficult to evaluate our impacts there. So you need to have the right tools, and you need to have proper research. The PIF4 agency funded a project to be able to have multi-criteria assessment that would go beyond the mere basics. And we therefore were able to look at VR, augmented reality, and mixed reality. So all of extended reality. We did not really look at metaverse and Web3. That's a different branch of work that we did not look at. But we're looking at all that is included in extended realities with consortium partners. Anyone who has an expertise there is welcome to work with us. We have already our planning for 2023. Of course, there's a lot of awareness raising that has to be carried out. But there's also the need for a full assessment matrix and the need to communicate clearly on that and to also put it at the disposal of other actors. I think that it's at least an answer to the question of how do we assess the impacts. Patrick, you were nodding. I wanted to ask you about awareness raising at the CMN. How was your project perceived internally? What about your teams? Do they know about it? Do they like it? The project that we carry out with ZENT is also a PIA4 project, and we work with two other partners. Garou, that develops a persistent 3D universe. Some call it a metaverse. And Mitolab, that also develop a video streaming platform. Those two technologies can be quite resource intensive, but both those partners were immediately ready to work with us. So, of course, you need to measure, but before that, those platforms that already exist. Of course, they sprout new projects all the time. But even within the architecture of some of those projects, some aspects are already there. In the persistent universe, for example, you know that it's not fully persistent. It can be disconnected sometimes to save resources. And some tests seem to indicate that it's actually a solution that is acceptable to users. And those two partners accepted to try new things and to work with us. The first thing is how portable are those platforms? If you look around today, and if you ask people, people will tell you that their activities are in the cloud, and they don't know where they are really concretely in a very tangible manner. And there's always this question of, is it worth it? There are so many different issues at stake here. Bandwidth, for example. We always need more bandwidth. We want to disseminate our work towards the broadest audience possible. We had remote visits from schools, for example. But schools usually don't have like the latest equipment. They have poor bandwidth, they have old computers, and that means that if you want to have schools among your audience, then you need to have lower bandwidth technology. Another thing that we don't want to have in our experience is to have something that is only accessible to people who have the latest helmets, for example. Not everyone has them. So when we develop our experiences, it's always going to be on multiple media, because we don't want to force people into buying a helmet if they want to experience it. So we'll have other kinds of experience that will be developed along with the VR experience. Jérôme David, same question. What about awareness raising? You have clients who have specific demands and expectations. Is there a risk for greenwashing? Do you get very whimsical proposals? Do you have clients who want to turn green overnight? Well, greenwashing is indeed a concern. And it's not always voluntarily. It's not because people say, I'm going to greenwash. It's because they have expectations and they should be more humble as to what is actually possible within a given time frame. So we need to take into account the fact that there will be mistakes. Mistakes will be made, and we need to be ready to accept that and to know that we will need to improve on an ongoing basis. For example, for ecotoxicity, the uncertainty interval is very high. So again, we need to be able to analyze the data and to know that we're going to improve over time. Same thing for ACV, for carbon emissions, we're already better today, but for everything else, we're basically just starting. We have a lot of uncertainties there. So we need to be humble and to understand that there are a lot of honest mistakes that are going to be made. Now, once you know that there has been a mistake, what do you do? That's the actual question. And I think that's the actual biggest danger that we have. We need to be very hands-on, very pragmatic. We need to be ready to rethink what we do, to look at the data, at the latest data. We need to look at the latest studies, the latest calculations, the latest databases. We need to be very vigilant and to be able to update our practices. But we need to be also very vigilant with that. There's a lot of progress that is done on everything that has to do with the digital world. And in the near future, for example, rather than taking emission factors, we might be taking other data. We'll be using actual data rather than emission factors because we can assess them and measure them. So if you have someone who bought an electric car, for example, they will then notice that the results from their shift in consumption will probably not be as good as what they were hoping to see. So that's really a methodological point. But we need to have critical reviews, including of the data. Today, when looking at ACV, we need to be aware of the fact that we're looking at very long life cycles of those projects. It takes a full year of study before you can do anything. And we need to be able to scale up. It's really artisanal right now, and we need to scale it up. We need to make it industrial scale so that those tools and those indicators can be used by a broader audience. Florian GUILLANTON, I imagine that you will agree with what we've just heard and the fact that we need to iterate the process. That's one of the basic building blocks in this design. We move forward, we fail, and we start over again. Do you have specific examples of discussions that you had on projects where you were able to change things, to turn them around, and to change the expectations of the client?
Well, sure. I mean, I won't give names, but a manufacturer of printers came to us when we were in our early years, in fact. So, but there are times when, we will choose or reject certain projects. So that's important to do. And so there was this printer manufacturer, so there's paper, okay, can be recycled, right? But we asked, did you do a life cycle analysis? But, you don't just pull the paper out of your hat, nor the ink. But they had done this for some of their more problematic products, pushing or overconsumption in particular. So yes, but it's true that this company wanted to really communicate about the fact that they were trying to move toward a more green operation. So, but they considered an experiment, and well, I guess there was some things that they accepted, that we were working with a lot of unknowns, but we did the LCA, working with the data at hand. We did some comparisons with recycled components or recycled papers. It's looking at the proportion of electronic components. It's not the same. It's a huge Excel file, and it's not very fun to put together. But once you've done that, we could say, if the machine is used for such a duration, and at the time, recycled paper was actually having a bigger impact on certain energy consumption, but not on the forest. And so we told them that, well, given maybe a higher level of maintenance, it's still consuming energy and materials. And so is it worth it, in fact? Because, in fact, you could be in big trouble if you communicate about this thing, but in fact, there's a lot of inconsistencies, so it can be a risk. So, there are a lot of unknowns here, and you're on a slippery slope if you start announcing the virtuous qualities of this new model. So I think it's best, we told them we think it's best not to be making any fabulous promises, because it's true that some things might be underestimated, certain processes are poorly known. So all of those unknowns, you can anticipate some of them. And so for me, coming from a design background, for me, how do you take these LCAs, which are rather accounting? It's a very accounting type of approach, and how do you connect that with the creative world? And particularly some, creative types consider that this is going to hinder their creative process. Whereas for us, I think the idea is to identify very quickly if an idea is potentially going to have a very negative environmental impact. And so you can maybe start changing tacks earlier in the process. So, when you think about creating something new, of course we can't do LCAs of everything all the time, but it is a question of being more aware before you go too far in your creative process down a dead end, or down a toxic end. So that's the idea, is to raise awareness about the types of things that could be potentially very polluting. Okay, so for Landia, you're also in the creative industries. I'm sure there's a lot of things that you've learned through this process. Have you discussed with other creative people, creative professionals? Well, a lot of it is tied to your particular awareness. For example, we've all know now that it's good to eat organic and more fruits and vegetables. And so little by little, people want to understand. And so once you've learned this, okay? It's like the storytelling, okay? So, you know, instead of filming a shot with somebody in a helicopter for 30 minutes, it's better just to film the shot where the character comes in and said, I had a great helicopter ride, okay? So these are the types of choices where you begin to think about them more automatically. You don't necessarily have to go through all the measurements. There are some that you begin to learn quickly which ones are going to be problematic. Okay, but and then there are specialists to help you with that. So we've been talking a lot about measurements and very little about the values behind all this. So why are we measuring? It's because we want to identify the value of these immersive projects in the light of their environmental, health, and social impact. You know, so many different types of impact. And so do they bring real value compared to that cost? We think that is something that deserves more study. So for me, you know, there's a little exercise. You know, I put together a list of all of the justifications that I was hearing for or against, in fact, immersive technologies in the metaverse, given those risks. And what's interesting to note is that on the one side, you can see justifications based on science. You know, we need to divide our emissions by 2, so cut our emissions by half to avoid 2 temperature rise within 10 years, okay? So it means a global reduction of our energy consumption. Currently, digital consumption is doubling every 10 years. Digital energy consumption. And so the digital world is not at all trending to a reduced consumption. So, you know, we can see the budgets can be huge as well. But it's not just about trying to reduce the rate of increase, but to see can these technologies be turned around, in fact, to help us reduce consumption elsewhere. Otherwise, we are not part of the solution, we're part of the problem. So we can see that there's something going on here. You know, there's a lot of belief systems at work here, and people begin to, you know, for some, challenge these technological innovations is it's blasphemous to a certain extent. People don't want to hear it. And so, yeah, for some people, that's the case. It's a belief system, in fact. And if there isn't constant, quick technological innovation is a world that is uninteresting. Particularly given the rather stressful reality around us. So some people want that continuous. It can be very psychological. You know, some of us grew up with this. You know, we've grown up working on screens, cut off from what's going on out in the street. And so this idea of measurement, the whole idea behind that is, in fact, to say, well, now we can get more precise data in terms of impacts in relation to the global limits. And there's a lot of different usages as well. There are a lot of usages that have nothing to do with a shared happiness, let me put it that way. And so the idea is to try to step away from some of those belief systems. Patrick Bergeot. Well, the measuring, yes, allows us to have a more objective view of things, but of course, so we know the benefits for museums is to reach certain audience that can't come to us. So, so for example, hospitalized children. Without a digital application, well, how can we measure this in terms of the consumption? Well, yes, well, we want the data to be able to answer that question. And also, we had 700 Malaysian visitors who didn't come, but they were able to visit thanks to our virtual offering. So, our mission is to disseminate and share. Okay, but, this is a very important question about these immersive technologies. For us, yeah, we want to know the answers so that we can make the right choices. Maybe we don't need immersive for everything, of course. We're going to be running some experiments, in fact, within a startup called Tamanois. And it's interesting what they're doing because, okay, virtual reality is fine, but you need those special goggles. What about sound immersion? Here you can do some really impactful things that are much more easy to broadcast with a much lower impact. And so, okay, here, we want to understand the satisfaction of visitors, but then it's the environmental impact. If we can get a good visitor experience with the less impact, then all the better.
Jérôme David, et même question pour
Jérôme David.
Est-ce que on peut rêver d'un avenir?
Can we imagine a low-tech future? So, on the technological side, well, I'm probably not the best person to develop low-tech solutions, but I think we're all going to have to go that direction. Everything that digital technologies have been bringing for the past 30 years, we can see this is a huge contribution. It's true that the mentality in the industry is always just more. The high performance, we're always thinking of high digital performance before we're thinking about environmental performance. So we're going to have to reverse that trend. And we really have to focus on, not producing, okay? And low-tech is all about frugality. That's the first thing. That's the very first question. Can I get the same benefits for visitors and users? Can I get the same level of a good level of satisfaction with far less environmental impact? And I have developed a lot of those high-consuming solutions. Okay, so and it's true that it's in the mindset to always think of the digital performance. Whereas the environmental concerns is really like the, just a week before the software is published. It's this, so we have to go back to the drawing board, guarantee traceability, start approaching a development from the other end, and everything that isn't traceable needs to be eliminated, so if low-tech will do the job, then that's what the job that we should be doing. Florian, you talked about the promises of digital technologies. Well, Jérôme just gave a very good description of that. For me, the whole idea of low-tech can be very inspiring. In fact, for me, and in my own belief system, you know, we can't do only low tech. So I don't think we can go in that direction entirely, because sometimes low-tech solutions can be complex and troublesome, in fact. But what's good about it is that it does draw attention to the fact that not everything has to be ultra-high performance. So for me, there's the question of usages as well. You know, we could talk about health applications, culture, entertainment. So what technological intensity should be applied to these different usages? Okay, I'm not an engineer, so I can't directly answer it, but for me, it's perhaps for certain usages, you know, you do have to ask yourself the question, is there a very particular benefit of high-tech? But also thinking about repairability, as Landia mentioned earlier. You know, the complex systems, well, there's also supply issues. They involve a lot of extractive industries, or there's exploitation involved. And people are totally unaware of this. So if we put that back into, you know, a more holistic thinking, we then can completely redefine our standards. And of course, well, then you have to look at the business models as well. So yes, the political and economic questions tend to be ignored. You know, we tend to separate them but there are a lot of high-stakes interests at play here. And well, then, and what can our governments do to set certain boundaries as well? But I think, yes, there is work that can be done to reduce, you know, the surplus goods for an end value that isn't obvious, in fact. Okay, thank you. Landia, final question for you. Two-part question. What's your next project? And did you take a different approach for the next project? And as a producer, what advice would you give to an author-producer about how to approach environmental responsibility at the design stage? These debates can go on for hours, of course. They're very interesting. For me, in 2023, I'm going to be very busy with the CPIR project that I mentioned earlier. So I'll be more of a in research in the consortium that I'm working with currently. And on the production side and writing, I don't think I'll be doing any more extended reality developments. In fact, or very little, and only for very specific reasons. For me, I want any project I do to be in line with the Paris Treaty. And so here there's a lot of work to be done, and I think you know, the cultural industry has this responsibility as well. I think the more people that we can be made aware of the stakes here, the better. And there's also the question of the platforms as well. So not creating layers and layers and layers of usages. There would have to be a genuine value. And so, for example, in the health sector, virtual reality helped people with their rehab when emerging from respiratory assistance due to COVID. So we know that there are cases where there's a true value of the virtual reality. But it's not just because it makes sense in some applications that we need to plunge into a wider usage. There's an image that I really like in the Blanc-Covici comic book. Christophe Blanc, the character, in fact, is in his kitchen, opening all of the cupboards, and they're all empty. You know, so, and at the same time, you can see a lot of waste in the living room, and you can see the waste accumulating, and yet he's starting to lack things, and so it means be careful. So do not. You know, so the message is do not massively adopt a usage that goes counter to frugality. Well, it can be applied in many different ways in many different fields. Patrick Bergeot, how do you go about enlightening your counterparts and colleagues? Well, we are starting with experiments and then sharing what we learn to be able to develop approaches to learn and decide if something is really worth using an immersive technology. That's the real motivation behind what we're doing currently. Okay, so let's see if we have any questions. If anyone has a question for our 4 guests. Hello, I have a question about the tools for measuring these impacts. How do you see these evolving? Will it be easier to measure one's carbon footprint, one's carbon impact? Well, for the tools, we're moving from one world of software that was only used by experts, whereas we're moving toward more accessible types of tools so that non-experts can begin to conduct their own measurements. These are becoming more and more available because it's true that a lot of it was proprietary software. Now we're seeing more open source software. And so more and more people are contributing to that. So to me, we're moving in that direction, and it has to be made available to non-experts. So the indicators, yes, but people have to understand what they are. You know, going from raw data to an indicator, well, you know, there's a lot of mistakes can be made in the evaluation. So people need to be able to understand what type of data needs to go into the measurement, and from there be able to make the right choices based on appropriate indicators. But of course, the very first thing is to reduce. Florian? Well, yes, it's true that there are a lot of indicators out there, but the French National Research Center has been working on what they call the Eco-Index, Eco-Info and Eco-Index for websites. This tool will run a check on a website, and they explain their methodology, and it's open to all. Okay, it doesn't automatically mean that it's good, but the idea is very good. And then you get a score for your website. And, well, they say themselves that the tool is still a work in progress. There are quite a few other tools that have emerged in the past year or so. For a website, it is one thing, but the databases require more tools that have to be installed on the servers to be able to get the proper measurements. Now, I know that the Google Lighthouse is working on this. But though, but we know that Google is already a problematic company. But we are starting to see some interesting research emerge from them, and on their dashboard there are counters. Okay, it doesn't include the Scope 3. So the induced emissions, so they're only on Scope 1 and 2. But in fact, in digital, it's Scope 3 that counts. It's not Scope 1 and 2. And that's not currently being measured. And some of them, some players in that industry aren't too motivated because they know it's going to make them look bad. So you have to look at where does the tool come from, and there's no magic tool that's going to, free of charge, give you a complete answer about your website or your database. So that's, it's only the expert software that can make that possible. So, but what's interesting to see is that there are more and more options out there.
On the immersive technology side, that's really part of our work, and we're actually working on it right now. We've spent the last months on analyzing the state of the art, and we also got in touch with all the digital experts that are in charge of similar stuff to see what they can do, what they can initiate, what we can reuse. So yeah, there's a lot of work, but I think that by October or November next year, we'll have the beginning of a tool that will be usable by creators. It will be more precise by then. Good evening. My question goes to Jérôme David. In very concrete terms, your tool, your better cloud, your more greener cloud, is this useful or relevant for smaller companies, or do you have to be as big as the MCN for that to be relevant? Can I? That's the Center for National Monuments. Yes, absolutely. It is based on a cloud that we data center, that we opened in Avignon and that uses green hydrogen. So it's not far from Avignon, and there we have a digital system the idea is also that this place has to be to give up the possibility to have green power for our servers. But we're a small data center, and we adapt to what is available, the power that is available on site. So hydrogen has a lower rate of efficiency than the panels, but we do produce hydrogen during the summer months that can then be reused during the winter months. Of course, you have to be careful with hydrogen because it's an excellent storage vector, but if it has to be carried by truck, then you are losing out on a lot of the benefits. But basically, it's a very good source because you do not need to use electrochemicals. I don't know if that answers your question. But, oh yeah, the actual question was whether that's useful for smaller structures. Yes, it is. We have a fee structure that is similar to what you would have with our competitors like OVH or other data centers. So we're there on the market, and we then adapt to the digital needs, depending on whether you're hosting a website or a bigger platform. You will have different needs, but there are so many different services that you can really adapt. Our clients in the social economy, for example, we have specific fees, and we can also offer services to bigger companies who need big platforms. We work, for example, for the production of images for animated graphics. So that's a team of 10 people who work 24/7. It takes 54 minutes to generate just a single image. So that's a huge quantity of resources that are used for them, and that's the hidden part of our iceberg. So it's true that you have very different ranges of needs, but we want it to be accessible to everyone, so we adapt, basically. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Merci à vous quatre pour,
Thank you to the four of you
votre participation à cette
for being with us for this roundtable. Many thanks to our audience, and I will now give the floor back to Annabelle for a few words of conclusion. Conclusion not, but I would like to thank all of you for telling us about your experience in this field. Before we wrap up for today, we'd like just to say a few words about the organization of tomorrow's workshops. For those of you who will be with us again, we'll be looking at sustainable tourism for TÜRKIS, and we'll be looking at the mobility footprint of our audiences. After that, we'll be looking at how cultural and heritage sites can contribute to awareness raising, but also to the conservation of biodiversity. After that, in the afternoon, we'll have a cultural retail time with the pop-up store jury, the international jury this time, and then we'll go back to issues pertaining to the social transition. We'll be looking at collaboration within institutional networks. We'll be looking at how networks can work together to move this transition forward. And then we will have one last session with school residencies in museums and how they reinvent the relationship between a cultural space and pupils in schools. Thank you very much and enjoy your evening.